Hi, my name is Omar Dawahere. I'm the Assistant Director at the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies. And not much to the panel. And now I'm going to leave you with Claudia Norman. Thank you. Thanks for coming.
Thank you for coming. And just to remind you, we're going to be live streaming this event. So it's your last chance to look good. And please share this on your social media. Turn off your ringers, but tweet, Facebook, share whatever is happening here. And just want to let you know that every year we have the opening night at NYU, and this is the first time that we are partnering with Clark's, and we are very honored and very happy. Thanks for them. John Ackerman just made it here. Thank you so much, John, also for open your calendar. David, you are super busy, and obviously he's covering the elections, and it's a very busy time, and we really thank you for opening this hour in your busy calendar. And Roque, thank you so much for coming up and help us to moderate this and to kind of like open all the discussion that is much. We have 60 minutes to talk too much, and I hope we have the time to kind of like share a little bit with all of you. I'm not sure if we're going to be taking questions from the live stream. We're going to get questions maybe, so we will let you know. But basically, we want to thank you all for being here to open the opening night of the 13th edition of this festival. And every night we have a different event, and please take your brochure, take one so you can share it with your friends, and tell everyone that we are making a huge effort to make this type of events happen. So I think it's time to start. Thank you so much for coming, and so gracias.
Sure. Well, thank you, everyone. Can everyone hear me?
You probably use a microphone for the live stream. Otherwise you're not going to come out.
All right. So thank you, everyone. My name is Roque, and for me, just a tremendous pleasure and privilege to be over here with colleagues, Mexican colleagues in the United States. We have so many journalists doing such tremendous work in an environment that I think has been very adverse, and certainly anyone watching what's been going on in Mexico over the last decade, like myself from afar, it's been very disturbing to see sort of Mexico slide into this situation in which the drug war has become so dominant, a situation in which more than 100,000 people have lost their lives, including tens of thousands of desaparecidos, which is a certain kind of particular violence that's so symbolically associated with the dirty wars of the Cold War era. So, I think one of the things that's been going on is that journalists are sort of getting hit from both sides on that, where it's very difficult to understand whether the violence is coming from the state itself or from these illegal groups, or where, or some combination, or where one ends and the other begins. At the same time, we now have an administration, the Enrique Peña Nieto administration, that is very much obsessed with its own public image, particularly its image abroad, which adds another layer to the pressures that journalists work under. And finally, Mexico is taking on this tremendous role in the United States election, in which the Donald Trump campaign in particular has made sort of the cornerstone of its campaign to lie, and particularly about immigration and about Mexico, which is especially problematic, I think, when you're a journalist covering this election, because it takes away all this pressure from the Clinton campaign, because obviously the Democrats have their own problems when it comes to Mexico and when it comes to the United States' relationship with Mexico. So just with that as a background, we have two tremendous people who work in the Mexican media here. So just to get the ball rolling, I wanted to ask you all, see, what you think about what these trends that are going on mean for journalists working in Mexico today in the context of the drug war, under the Peña Nieto administration in a U.S. election year? We know there's risks, but what does that look like on a daily basis in terms of freedom of speech, and has Mexico become more or less democratic? John, you can start.
Should I grab this one? Hello, hello. You hear me? Yes, good. Thank you, Roque, Claudia, colegas del Centro de Estudios Latinoamericanos de NYU, David, colleague. I was telling Dave before the event that I still read David Brooks to find out about what's actually happening in the United States. I mean, he's in La Jornada, as a foreign correspondent in the United States, with this confused American media, or I don't know if it's confused would be the right word, but the confused situation, in which the media has been having a strange role. David always helps from Mexico to understand what's actually happening here. I hope we'll get link back to U.S. politics. But let's go to Mexico first. My most recent book is called The Myth of Democratic Transition, right? El mito de la transición democrática. And I think that the question of journalism and freedom of speech is one of the key areas which demonstrates the fact that Mexico has actually not undergone a democratic transition. I think that's where we need to start any kind of analysis of this issue from, because from the United States, both in official circles and also in academic circles and even critical circles, people seem to assume that somehow Mexico is a functioning democracy, right? That somehow up top we have strong institutions which are trying to do their best, and they're struggling against drug warlords, local corrupt politicians, but that somehow there's this decency at the top. And it is kind of true in the fact that the Mexican state is actually powerful. It's not a failed state, right? The Mexican institutional apparatus and legal apparatus, I'm a law professor, so is actually quite beautiful and stands up comparatively internationally very well, particularly compared to the United States. So if you look at, for instance, election law, right? A Mexican election law is, light years ahead of U.S. election law, which is basically, I wouldn't want to say non-existent, but quite corrupt at the source in terms of, there's no independent electoral agencies, there's no control over private funding, there's not even a single ballot in the United States. In the year 2000, Gore won, but didn't become president, little details like that. In Mexico, we have fraud too, of course, but at the legal level, the institutional level, we're doing really well. And so there's that gives the impression that somehow things are struggling but still going through, and the Peña Nieto administration plays on this a lot. So, for instance, when we have a problem of disappearances, not only the Peña Nieto administration but the government of the PRI and the PAN in particular pass a new law, which is the anti-disappearance law. Right? We have corruption problem, and we get a new law, which is anti-corruption law. Right? And so we have this sort of simulation at the institutional level, but actually what is happening, in specifically the issue of freedom of speech and journalism, is that we have a very intimate complicity between the highest government officials and criminal elements in society. And the border between criminality and institutions is not clear. And some people call this, a narco-government even. You see it in the recent case of Javier Duarte, the governor of Veracruz, who is sort of the quintasencia of the situation. And you see it in the annual reports, for instance, by Article 19 on freedom of expression, right? So if you look at the Article 19 reports, one of the things that stands out most clearly is that they systematically show that the vast majority of the attacks on journalists in Mexico have direct participation or complicity of government agencies, right? Either police or all the way up to higher government agencies. So this is not just a question of chaos at the bottom of narcos knocking out journalists who are putting in at risk their livelihoods of these narcos, but we actually have a much higher level of a structured relationship between crime, corruption, and government officials who are together threatened by independent journalism and together attack journalists, right? We can go into statistics later, but that's sort of how I would like to at least start out this discussion, is that we can't separate the local and the federal, or the social and the government, but what we have is actually a highly organized criminal racket between government and society, which are together repressing journalists. And I'll leave it there, and we'll get on more. Sorry about that. Thanks.
And certainly been covering in the United States, but your impressions, Debbie?
Should I get this or not? I don't even know. Yeah. Funciona? Sí. First of all, again, thanks to the organizers and to everything, and to Claudia for the invitation. And it's always a pleasure to be with John so I can learn something. And essentially all I have to add is, besides what he said, it was a great description of where the source of the problem is in Mexico, and what the essence is that we're confronting. At the same time, it's and just to add to that, the Mexican government's decision is that Mexico doesn't have a problem; it has an image problem, and that's both in Mexico, and this is what I have to cover here when they come here. And they've hired PR firms and given millions of dollars because to fix the image, there's no problem. When you have dozens and dozens and dozens of our colleagues dead, it's not an image problem. It's, and so this idea that that as journalists, we have to confront exactly what John said, this very complicated choreography in order to do any kind of real journalism. It leads to self-censorship on purpose. If you're an editor and you're sending somebody out to Guerrero or to the border, you're going to feel that who you sending out there, you're going to assume the responsibility for that person getting killed or disappeared or threatened, And so there's this miserable situation. At the same time, you have to figure out how do you get the truth out of here. So what we're struggling with is the essential, it goes back to the essential job of a journalist, is confronting in a world of image and illusion, which is what this U.S. election is, which is what is happening in Mexico, is how do you get to the truth in this complicated way, and how do you not, and in Mexico, trying to get to the truth is one of the most dangerous things you can try to do at this point.
I'm curious about something that you just said there, because one of the things that I remember reading in an article not too long ago that referred not to Peña Nieto's press secretary, but to his international brand ambassador or something like that. I mean, what has it been like personally having to deal with such a publicity-driven, and just to emphasize too, I mean, it's not like it's really helping him that much. His publicity, his approval ratings are the lowest in modern Mexican history. However, I mean, I'm just curious, if what that's like on a personal level, having to deal with that extra veil over power.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. It's not very good, so it's not that hard to confront because it falls apart almost by itself. Somebody's making lots of money. This is a great industry, but it works at a certain level. So if you go to the think tanks in Washington or New York City, or you go to some of the every time that Peña Nieto comes here or any government official comes here, they get prizes as Statesman of the Year, Finance Minister of the Year. The guy who just got fired just finished getting recognized by the international community. So the elites seem to be quite happy here, and that the image works at the elite level. The only problem is if you talk to any immigrant, they know something very different, and that image is absolutely, fabricated. And so but it does work at a certain level. So when they do go to Washington and they meet their counterparts, there's this very odd thing where they will not recognize what John just said, that Mexico's not a functioning democracy. You cannot have an impunity level of Mexico, which is second in the world, or the second worst in the world after the Philippines, or something like that, and call yourself a democracy. I cannot be there and have a colleague disappear and you not know where to turn to, because there are no mechanisms, none, that will help. Right?
There are mechanisms on the book, as I was mentioning.
Right,
There's a Fiscalía Especializada para los Delitos contra la Prensa. There's a mecanismo interinstitucional de seguimiento, defensa de periodistas. There are all these institutional things which they always point to whenever the UN or Reporters Without Borders come in and say, what are you doing about this? They say, well, look, we have it on the law. Look, it's on the books. But when you actually try to use them, just a very short anecdote. About 2 years ago, I was getting systematic death threats on social networks, right? And I talked to my friends in the NGOs, and I said, so what should I do? And they said, well, if you bring the case formally to the Attorney General's office, all you're doing is putting the soga al cuello, right? Because what you do is you open up yourself to Attorney General investigation into those who are threatening you, but very quickly this turns into investigation against you, right? So if they want to investigate the threats coming against you on social networks, they can use that as an excuse to hack into your social networks or into your email accounts, or because now you're part of a official judicial investigation which you yourself has opened. So you can just see at one level how this happens, and this happens at a massive level with people who are actually in the trenches. I'm in Mexico City, Dave's here in New York. But this at a much more intense level happens at the grassroots level, in which a journalist, if you go to the Attorney General, local Attorney General, to actually denounce what's happening to you, the most likely effect will be that things will get worse, because you have to give your personal information, you have to open yourself up. I just want to offer some statistics here. So if you look at from 2000 to 2016, the last 16 years, the years of democratic transition, we have at least, these are conservative numbers, 115 assassinated journalists, 25 disappeared, 2 jailed, and in total over 1,049 aggressions against journalists. Because assassination, disappearance, and jailing are extreme cases, but we have over 1,000 cases of broad threats. And these are very conservative numbers, because these are only ones people who actually publicly denounce and then are collected by Article 19 in particular. This is a very interesting graph. This is, you can see, it looks like a nice target, right? The black ring on the outside are the largest one. This is the question here is, who are the agresores contra la prensa? This is during 2014, but it hasn't changed much in the recent, in 2015, 2016. So these are the people who actually denounce crimes, pressures, or any kind of attacks against them as a journalist. Who do they identify, or who is identified through the preliminary investigations as the responsible party for this attack on the press? The largest circle on the outside are government functionaries, right? Everything from police to higher level government officials. The next ring is unknown, right? And the gray is particulares, right? People who are not involved with government. So you can see that the vast majority of the cases are linked to the government. And the fact that the federal institutions are not doing much about this is an indication this is not just local government. Take a case in point, the Ayotzinapa case, which is one that everybody knows about. In Ayotzinapa, supposedly they're trying to blame the local officials, but it turns out that there are 2 enormous military bases located directly in Ayotzinapa, the 27th and 35th, who were, if not directly participant in, obviously knew everything about that was happening that night. This is federal officials of the military. In terms of freedom of expression, one of the most egregious part of what happened the night of Friday, September 26, 2014, was that you guys know that there were 43 disappeared students, but there are 3 assassinated students that night. Those 3 students were assassinated in cold blood when they were giving a press conference. Okay? Friday around 9 o'clock at night was the disappearance, the general attack on the buses, hundreds of kids running all up around, 43 disappeared to this day. Some of them stayed in Iguala. New people came in as reinforcements. For instance, Omar Garcia came in. And that night, at around 11 o'clock at night, in downtown Iguala, they they organized a press conference to inform, mostly local press at that time, because they didn't have time, people come from Mexico City, about what had happened in terms of the attack on the buses and the disappearance of their colleagues. As they were speaking, like us right here, 2 heavily blindados, how do you call that? Armored trucks, vehicles came by and just shot right at the kids who were giving information about what had happened that day. Right? And those were the 3. Well, 2 of them were killed there at the moment. Mondragon, Julio Cesar Mondragon, who was the guy who was tortured later, then came out on the social networks, ran away from that press conference and was discovered later. So you can see that, in many ways, even the very Iguala case is not just about disappearances, but it's about freedom of expression. Because what really hurt the regime, and that's what really changed the international narrative of Peña Nieto, was this such a blatant attack on the kids. And this is not just a local issue, but it's a national issue.
And speaking about the Fiscalia thing that they have the special office to investigate attacks against journalists, I want to highlight one piece that we did publish on the Huffington Post when Anabel Hernandez describes her experience after receiving a very direct threat to her and her family in her apartment in Mexico City. She went to this office. There's videotape of 4 people approaching her apartment, going in to leave the threat that she describes in the piece, and then there's video of the car with the license plates. She went, she gave her denunciation, she went back. Weeks later, they hadn't so much as located who it was that owned the car. I mean, we're talking like extremely basic things. And, as she talks about in the piece, one of the people that she spoke with said, "Don't worry, we're going to find the verdad histórica, what happened," which was also, she interpreted as a threat, right? Which, with good reason, because no one uses a tortured phrase when they're really speaking. Actually, I mean, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that too. Like, why is it that the Ayotzinapa case in particular became so emblematic? I mean, what was it about it that allowed it to sort of penetrate? Because killings with impunity in Mexico happen all the time, but this one made it through Mexico, international. I mean, I would say it's become probably the most prominent international human rights movement that we've seen cross borders into the United States from Latin America in a long time. What was it about it that made it so special?
I mean, one was the number, 2 was that it was kids and that it was students. It wasn't a confrontation between peasant leaders, or it wasn't a where narcos might have been. It was, and then it was the kind of students they were, which of course they were from the Normal, and the Normales in Mexico have a long history that goes back to times of Cárdenas. And especially Ayotzinapa has a very historic place in Mexican history. Teachers have often been, in Mexico, teachers are probably the most important community leaders by definition. They're often the only ones that are bilingual between indigenous and Spanish languages. They often are the only literate people, and so that they solve all kinds of problems, and they're also among the most revered because they're doing one of the most noble things there is in human practice, which is to pass on knowledge to the next, right? And consciousness, etc. So all of this, I mean, it's a long story in terms of what the Normales do in Mexico and why, in particular, this place have always been sort of part of the formation of the future generations, the vanguard of progressive and left politics in Mexico, especially in the countryside. are people who come out of the normales, and that's why it's a target. That's why the government has, and this is not the first time, they've always been a target. There've been, there's long-term attempt to dismantle them as long as, once from forever. The two most famous guerrilla leaders in Mexico in the 70s were teachers who were trained, one of them at that institution. And so it has a long history, and so the idea is to break these places. And so the attack took place on all kinds of levels. But essentially it was a very basic thing of any single student, mother, whatever. This is, 43 NYU students disappear who were at the education department. This is the level of a crime that is, would stop everything. The FBI would have to be involved. What do you mean they disappeared? And et cetera. And so by its own weight, it's become this. Then the government responds to it, and some of what John is talking about, of this absolutely cynical response of first saying it was a local issue, when everybody knows that that wasn't true immediately. And then the way it was treated, and the pretense and the farce of the investigation, which was then revealed completely by the Inter-American Human Rights Commission group of experts, who essentially, went through each piece of evidence and discarded it from the investigation. And so but it also, because of the historic nature of the place, there's an accumulation of repression because of Guerrero, which has been one of the epicenters of the drug war. I can't remember what the percentage of poppy but it's like massive percentage that originates in Guerrero and comes here. The reason for that also has to do with government economic policies over many years. It's one of the poorest areas of Mexico, if not the poorest. It's because of it links just geographically, historically, on plain human indignity level. All of this, all of a sudden, it became sort of an epicenter of describing exactly the opposite of the official image. I mean, and the government couldn't figure out how to control it. They thought they had it under control, and they lost it, and they've lost it till now. I think.
Yeah, I think David is absolutely right. This broke the narrative in a particularly clean way. What was the story that they had sold to us, going back to Felipe Calderón? Whenever there was a massacre or any kind of attack, Felipe Calderón said, well, 90% of them were were narcos.
Right.
I don't know how he gets that percentage. And if they were narcos, they didn't deserve to die, right? But that was his sort of his theory to always, there are a lot of dead, but they're just killing. Se están matando entre ellos, right? They're killing themselves between them. And so in the end, there's it's almost this suggestion that there's kind of this ethnic cleansing going on. The bad guys are killing each other. This was very dangerous discourse, but it somehow worked for certain sectors of international public opinion because it was seen that there was the bad guys killing themselves between them, and that somehow there wasn't any kind of direct attack by government institutions against the people, right? And that's what's broken with Peña Nieto in general, and specifically the case of Ayotzinapa. It's clear that many of these massacres are direct attacks by government, often federal institutions, against groups of dissidents, right? And that's what we're really seeing in Ayotzinapa. Beyond the fact of there's the drug nexus. There's lots of mining interests. It's a complicated story in the Ayotzinapa case. It's not just like in the 70s, the dirty war, but there is still a lot of that in there, and people can see that because these kids, even Murillo Karam from the very first day, refused to say that they were narcos or that somehow they had it coming to them, right? And so that's what really broke the narrative, that it was the government. That's why fue el Estado. Es el Estado was the big hashtag in Mexico, that it was just so clear that it was government agents killing innocent kids, right? And that opens things up and changes the narrative. But the problem is bringing us to today is that my feeling, I mean, you guys, David will know more about this, you guys will have more to say about this, is that although it did break the narrative, it hasn't completely done its job. Ayotzinapa and other massacres. Ayotzinapa was just one of a whole series. Just 3 months ago in Nochistlán, the federal police in trying to desalojar a carretera, right, getting free up a highway, killed 9 and injured over 100 people in Nochistlán with bullet wounds. This was just in June, 3 months ago. That was also a clear case of the federal police stepping in and attacking a community of unarmed, protesting community. And so all of a sudden what was before a sort of the chaos of the narco-drug war is now a so-called democratic government attacking directly its people. But once again, I still have this question of whether we actually have broken through or not. I mean, you can see it through, small indications of the Merit Initiative stuff. Last year, in September 2015, 15% of the Merit money was temporarily withdrawn as sort of a demonstration of the U.S. government's concerns towards the human rights situation in Mexico. Since then, things have just gotten worse, and all of a sudden, now in September, probably because of electoral considerations on both sides of the border, all of a sudden, everything's okay now. Merida went through smoothly in September now. If you look at the yearly reports of the State Department, there's a section which is about political crimes, right? In which there's a section of, have there been any political prisoners or political arbitrary detentions or attacks in the last year? You go to a place like Cuba or Venezuela or Russia or any anti-American country, and that's full of a long list. But in Mexico, to this day, year after year, there's a general recognition of a chaotic situation of human rights violations, aggressions against journalists. But that line of, is there any political violence and arbitrary detentions of political prisoners? It says, there were no cases in the past year. Just like that, the sentence. And so there is still a generalized whitewashing operation by the United States State Department, which of course influences directly the dominant media as well. There's and which still, trying to keep up this image of Mexico somehow still this kind of democratic country, which is worrisome because this leads to the continuation, the repetition of these cases. The Nochistlán case is perhaps even more brutal and direct than Ayotzinapa. You can't really compare them, but it's at least as bad as Ayotzinapa, the Nochistlán massacre, just a few months ago.
And how do you see that? I mean, you cover a lot the bilateral relationship. I mean, how do you see Mexico getting its Merida funding? Just to clarify, too, that Mexico is going to get tens of millions of dollars from the Department of Defense that has nothing to do with Merida, regardless of whether or not that passes. So in some senses, it is symbolic, but it is, a lot of people think it's a powerful symbol. I'm curious how you write about that, how you think about it, and how you think the Mexican public thinks about it.
I mean, there's one of the growing demands among many groups, including people, the parents of Ayotzinapa, but also more and more around Mexico, is among their demands, among the great victims movement, which I still wish I'd had changed their name, but anyway, is one of the demands is stop Merida. And that wasn't on the agenda before, except among experts and people who knew about the bilateral stuff. It was, or NGOs or whatever. But now it's a popular thing because they see the direct link of these are either U.S. trained or U.S. supplied or U.S. endorsed operations that are going on. And now the U.S. is stuck with this because it did endorse the Calderón strategy from the get-go. And so now it's invested all this money, and both Republican and Democratic, it's a bipartisan, polarization in Washington sort of disappears when it comes to do with free trade or what Wall Street needs or on military, support in other countries. So when you look at how polarized and divided Washington is, it's very funny where there is none. Um, there is, it's truly bipartisan, and this kind of thing is, and so they're invested in it, so they have to justify it now, and so it becomes this debate where, yes, we know that there's all kinds of things, and the last thing was we're not going to send any more arms, or going to send. Now we're going to look at community level judicial reforms. This is about 2 or 3 years ago that the emphasis changed. Trying to get away from the direct military link, but and then when Peña Nieto came in, he promised a huge overhaul, of shifting the emphasis of the drug war, moving away from the Calderon thing, moving away from the U.S. sanction kind of things. At least that's what he was saying. We're going to take care of it. We're going to control the bilateral relationship around the drug war. It's not going to be each of these independent secretarias and with their counterparts in the U.S. And that hasn't happened. Nothing's gone either forward or backward. It's sort of this inertia where both sides are stuck with this.